The wedding ceremony was calculated to inspire confidence in two very different populations. Broadcast across both Yveran imperial space and human coalition territories, it blended traditions from both cultures with the careful precision of a diplomatic treaty, which, fundamentally, it was. Ambassador David Reyes stood on the elevated platform in the grand hall of the Yveran Imperial Palace, wearing formal attire that had required 3 fittings and input from cultural advisors on both sides. The outfit merged human and Yveran aesthetic sensibilities in a way that he hoped looked dignified rather than ridiculous, though he had his doubts. Beside him, Queen Thessara of the Yveran Empire wore traditional royal regalia that made her look simultaneously magnificent and intimidating. The formal robes emphasized her natural elegance, and the elaborate ornaments adorning her long ears, those distinctive features that marked Yveran physiology, denoted her supreme authority within the empire. She was beautiful in an alien way that David's brain couldn't quite process as human beauty, but he could appreciate the aesthetic achievement of her appearance even if it didn't trigger the biological responses his species associated with attraction. Not that it mattered. This wasn't about attraction or romance. This was about securing an alliance that both their governments desperately needed. The Yveran Empire required human technological assistance to stabilize infrastructure that was failing after decades of deferred maintenance and resource constraints. The human coalition needed access to Yveran trade routes and strategic positioning in a contested region of space, where 3 other powers were competing for dominance. A formal alliance through marriage, an ancient Yveran tradition that carried more legal weight than any treaty, solved both problems efficiently. David spoke his vows in carefully rehearsed Yveran, promising partnership and mutual support. The words translated roughly to, "I bind myself to your purpose and offer my capabilities in service of our joined interests." It was remarkably unromantic even by diplomatic standards, but that was Yveran culture, pragmatic to a degree that made human bureaucracy seem sentimental. Thessara spoke her vows in standard, her accent precise but carrying the slight musicality that came from vocal anatomy evolved for a different language. "I accept your binding and offer reciprocal utility in pursuit of mutual advantage." The crowd applauded politely. Somewhere in coalition space, David's mother was probably crying. Somewhere in Yveran space, Thessara's council was probably running economic projections on the alliance benefits. Neither of them was thinking about love or companionship or any of the reasons humans usually married. This was business, formalized through ceremony and legalized through contract law that spanned 2 species. After the ceremony, they stood together for the official reception, shaking hands and exchanging polite conversation with dignitaries who congratulated them on a successful strategic alliance. Not a single person wished them happiness or asked about their feelings. Both human and Yveran guests understood exactly what this marriage was, a useful legal arrangement. That evening, back in their respective quarters in the imperial palace, they'd agreed on separate living spaces, which both found professionally sensible. David reviewed the briefing materials for his new role as royal consort. The formal duties included ceremonial appearances, coordination of human aid programs, and serving as a diplomatic bridge between coalition interests and Yveran governance. It was, essentially, his job as ambassador but with a fancier title and more formal clothing requirements. David could work with that. He expected their marriage to proceed exactly as planned. Professional cooperation, mutual benefit, formal politeness, and eventual success in achieving the diplomatic objectives both governments had set. What he didn't expect was that 3 months later, during the Kethros crisis that threatened to destabilize the entire region, Queen Thessara would prove to be not just a competent ally but genuinely interesting to work with. The crisis erupted with typical diplomatic subtlety, which is to say, none at all. A territorial dispute escalated into military confrontation, and suddenly both the Yveran Empire and human coalition faced the possibility of being drawn into a war neither could afford. David found himself working 18-hour days alongside Thessara, coordinating responses, managing diplomatic channels, and trying to find solutions that would prevent disaster. She was brilliant. Her strategic thinking was razor-sharp, her political instincts were excellent, and her ability to make difficult decisions quickly was impressive. But what struck David most was her absolute emotional control. She made decisions that would affect billions of lives with the same cool efficiency she might use to choose breakfast. When she authorized a preemptive military strike that would save lives overall but cause civilian casualties in the short term, she delivered the order without visible hesitation or regret. David didn't question the decision. He agreed it was strategically necessary. But an hour after she'd given the order, he found her alone in the strategy room, staring at the tactical display showing the region where the strike would be executed. "You made the right call," he said quietly, moving to stand beside her. Thessara glanced at him briefly, then returned her attention to the display. "I know I did. The mathematical analysis is clear. Civilian casualties from this strike. Approximately 300. Projected casualties if the conflict escalates without intervention, over 3,000. The decision is obvious." The decision being obvious doesn't make it easy to live with. Live with. Thessara's tone suggested genuine confusion. "I do not understand the phrase." "Knowing you made a choice that will result in people dying. Even when it's the right choice, it's still heavy. It's okay to acknowledge that." Thessara turned to face him fully, and David could see her processing this statement like it was in a foreign language she didn't quite speak. "You believe I should feel distressed by necessary decisions." "I think it's human and probably healthy to feel the weight of decisions that cost lives, even when those decisions are correct. You can do the right thing and still acknowledge the cost. That seems inefficient. There are 17 more crises requiring decisions tonight. Emotional processing of each decision would significantly slow response times." David almost smiled at the pure Yveran logic of that assessment. "Fair point. But just so you know, feeling conflicted about necessary but costly decisions doesn't make you a worse leader. It might actually make you a better one." Thessara studied him for a long moment, and David couldn't quite read her expression. Finally, she said, "You have a very human perspective on decision-making and emotional response." Guilty as charged. It is not a criticism, merely an observation. She turned back to the display. "I will consider what you have said about acknowledging costs, but for now, there are indeed 17 more crises requiring attention." "Understood. I'll be in the coordination center if you need another perspective on any of them." David left, and he didn't think much more about the conversation. It had been a small moment of human emotional processing meeting Yveran pragmatism. Interesting culturally, but not particularly significant. What he didn't realize was that Thessara would think about that conversation for days afterward. That someone could acknowledge both the strategic correctness of a decision and the emotional difficulty of making it, treating those as compatible rather than contradictory, was a concept entirely foreign to her cultural framework. And somewhere in the back of her mind, a quiet question began forming. What else had she been missing by viewing relationships purely through the lens of utility and strategic advantage? The Kethros crisis resolved after 6 weeks of intensive diplomatic and military coordination. The preemptive strike Thessara had ordered, combined with David's back-channel negotiations with neutral parties, created conditions for a ceasefire that held. By any objective measure, it was a successful outcome. Casualties minimized, regional stability maintained, the Yveran-human alliance strengthened through effective cooperation. Thessara expected to return to normal governance routines, with David resuming his role as useful but appropriately distant consort. Instead, something had shifted in a way she couldn't quite categorize. David continued showing up to strategy sessions even when his presence wasn't specifically required. Not to dominate discussions or push coalition interests, but simply to be there, offering perspectives when asked, providing comfortable silence when not. Thessara found his presence less intrusive than protocol would suggest it should be. One evening, after a particularly frustrating Imperial Council session, where three different noble factions had wasted 2 hours arguing about matters Thessara had already decided, she returned to her private study to find David already there, reviewing economic reports at the secondary desk she'd had installed for his use. The council was difficult today, he observed without looking up from his datapad. It wasn't a question, just an acknowledgement. Thessara appreciated the lack of intrusive inquiry. The council is always difficult. They believe their role is to provide wisdom, when primarily they provide obstruction disguised as deliberation. The senior counselor, Vethais, the one with the silver ear ornaments, he wasn't actually concerned about the trade agreement you proposed. He's positioning against your military reforms from last month. The trade objections are just leverage. Thessara looked up sharply from her own work. You determined this how? Body language, voting patterns, who he spoke with during recess breaks. Human diplomatic training emphasizes reading subtext and political maneuvering. Your council doesn't try to hide their machinations. They just assume no one is paying attention to the patterns beneath their stated positions. David finally looked up, meeting her gaze directly. If you want the trade agreement to pass, you could offer a minor concession on the military reforms, something that appears significant but doesn't actually alter the core policy. Vethais would likely accept that as victory and stop blocking everything else out of spite. It was sound political analysis, exactly the kind of tactical insight Thessara valued, because it was immediately useful. But what struck her was that David offered it without any apparent benefit to himself or to coalition interests. He was helping her navigate her own council simply because he'd noticed a pattern and thought she'd want to know. Why inform me of this? She asked. The trade agreement benefits Yveran interests more than human ones. Your government would likely prefer it remain stalled. Because you're trying to accomplish something useful, and I can help make it marginally less difficult. That's what partners do. Partners? The Yveran word he'd used, Caliph, translated roughly to allied utility providers. But the way David employed it carried connotations their language didn't quite capture. Over the following months, Thessara began noticing a pattern in David's behavior that didn't conform to her understanding of political alliances or useful consorts. He listened, not strategically, searching for advantage, but simply to understand. When she explained complex policy challenges, he asked questions that helped her clarify her own thinking rather than steering the conversation toward coalition priorities. When she expressed frustration with imperial bureaucracy, he didn't offer unsolicited solutions, just provided space for her to process aloud. When she made decisions he disagreed with, he stated his perspective clearly but accepted her final authority without resentment or passive aggression. It was profoundly unusual to have someone in her life who existed without apparent agenda, beyond being genuinely helpful. 5 months into their marriage, after Thessara had spent an exhausting day managing crisis response to a natural disaster in the outer provinces, David found her in the palace gardens at sunset. He didn't announce his presence or ask if she wanted company. He simply sat on the stone bench beside her and watched the sky shift through colors that had no names in either of their languages. After 10 minutes of comfortable silence, Thessara asked, "Don't you have responsibilities? Coalition coordination reports, diplomatic communications." "Probably, but they can wait an hour. You looked like you could use quiet company more than I needed to file routine paperwork." Quiet company is not a productive use of your time. Not everything needs to be productive, David said, still watching the sunset. Sometimes existing alongside someone who's had a difficult day has value even if nothing tangible gets accomplished. Thessara turned to look at him, searching for the logical framework she was clearly missing. What value does existing alongside someone provide if no problems are solved, no work is completed, no measurable utility is generated? David considered the question with the seriousness he brought to policy discussions. It provides the knowledge that you're not alone, that someone chose to be with you even when there was no immediate benefit to doing so. Humans call it companionship, and we consider it valuable even, maybe especially, when it's not productive in conventional terms. That seems inefficient. Probably is. But loneliness is also inefficient. It degrades decision-making quality, increases stress responses, reduces long-term cognitive sustainability. Companionship serves as preventive maintenance against the isolation that powerful people often experience. He paused, then added, "How many people in your life are present because they choose to be, rather than because duty or advantage requires it?" Thessara wanted to argue with this assessment but found she couldn't. Her counsel served because their positions required it. Her staff worked for her because they were employed to do so. Her subjects obeyed because she was their sovereign. Even David was present because a political arrangement had brought him here. Or at least, that's why he'd arrived initially. But sitting here in the gardens, having these conversations that served no strategic purpose, spending time together that generated no measurable diplomatic benefit, that wasn't required by any treaty or marriage contract. "Why do you do this?" she asked quietly. "Sit with me, offer perspectives without agenda, provide what you call companionship. What do you gain from interactions that produce no tangible utility?" David was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried an honesty that Thessara recognized as genuine. "Because somewhere over the past 5 months, I started to actually like you. Not Queen Thessara, the useful political ally, but Thessara the person. I enjoy our conversations. I find your perspective interesting. Your company has become something I value for reasons that have nothing to do with diplomatic advantage." He turned to look at her directly. "I realize Yveran culture doesn't really have a framework for this, but humans have a concept called friendship, relationships we choose to maintain purely because we value the other person, not because they're useful or because duty requires it. I think that's what's been developing between us, whether your culture has a word for it or not. Friendship." David used the human word because Yveran had no direct equivalent. The closest translations were Caliph personal, allied non-kin, or Verath chosen, selected utility peer, neither of which captured what David seemed to mean. "Yveran culture structures relationships hierarchically," Thessara said slowly, processing this claim. "We have rulers and subjects, employers and employees, family bonds and political alliances. But relationships chosen purely for mutual enjoyment without utility justification, that concept doesn't exist in our social frameworks." "I know, but that doesn't mean you can't experience it." David's expression was patient, like he was explaining something obvious to someone who'd never encountered the concept before. "These past months, when we've sat here in the gardens, or worked late on policy problems, or had those long discussions about cultural differences, did you continue those interactions only because they were strategically valuable?" Thessara wanted to say yes because that would fit the model she understood, but honesty, a trait she valued even when inconvenient, compelled a different answer. "No," she admitted. "They were pleasant, valuable in ways that transcended their utility. I found myself wanting to continue them even when they provided no measurable strategic advantage. She paused, searching for accurate language. "I looked forward to these interactions in ways I couldn't justify through traditional cost-benefit analysis." "That's friendship," David said simply. "Valuing someone's presence beyond what they can do for you. Choosing to spend time with them because the alternative, not spending time with them, feels like a loss. You might not have a word for it in Yveran, but you've been experiencing it." Thessara sat with this realization, trying to fit it into her understanding of relationships, and finding that it didn't quite fit anywhere in her existing categories. She'd somehow developed a friendship, a concept her culture didn't acknowledge, with her political husband, and the strangest part was that recognizing it didn't diminish its value. If anything, understanding what had been growing between them made it more precious, not less. I do not have proper cultural frameworks for processing this relationship category, she said finally. But I find I do not wish to lose what we have developed, regardless of what label we apply to it. Good, David said with a small smile. Neither do I. They sat together as the sunset faded into twilight, and Thessara experienced something she'd never quite felt before. Contentment that had nothing to do with successful governance or political achievement. Just the simple pleasure of existing alongside someone whose company she valued. It was inefficient, unproductive, and entirely outside her cultural norms. It was also, she was beginning to understand, one of the most valuable. 8 months into their marriage, Thessara realized with growing certainty that David had become someone she actively wanted to talk to, not because he was useful, though he remained that, but because his perspective interested her, his presence comforted her, and his company had become something she valued for reasons entirely disconnected from political advantage. This realization was simultaneously pleasant and deeply unsettling. Then the Kelvar succession crisis erupted, and Thessara's comfortable routine of gradually developing friendship was tested by political reality. The neighboring Kelvar Empire's ruler died without clear succession protocols, and 3 major factions immediately began positioning for civil war. The Yveran Empire, sharing a significant border with Kelvar territory, couldn't afford to ignore the situation. Wrong alliances could draw them into extended conflict. Failure to engage could result in chaos spilling across their borders. Thessara spent weeks in intensive negotiations, making calculated decisions about which factions to support, what resources to commit, how to maximize Yveran interests while minimizing risk exposure. David participated actively, using his coalition diplomatic credentials to open communication channels that wouldn't be available to Yveran officials. It was exactly the kind of useful contribution that had justified their political marriage. Then, during a critical negotiation session, where Thessara was preparing to commit military support to one Kelvar faction in exchange for favorable trade concessions, David did something that shocked her. He disagreed with her publicly. "Your Majesty," he said carefully, using her formal title because this was official business conducted before witnesses, "I believe we should reconsider this military commitment. The intelligence we've received about this faction's stability may be incomplete, and the support we're offering could prolong the conflict rather than resolve it efficiently." Thessara felt anger flash through her, not at the substance of his disagreement, but at the public challenge to her authority during high-stakes negotiations. "The analysis has been thorough and the decision matrix is clear. The commitment stands. With respect, the analysis assumes facts that haven't been independently verified. If those assumptions prove incorrect, we're not merely wasting resources. We're potentially supporting a faction that will collapse, which damages our credibility and their civilian population." The Kelvar faction representatives watched this exchange with barely concealed fascination. Thessara's own senior advisors looked uncomfortable, uncertain whether David's public disagreement constituted inappropriate breach of protocol or valuable alternative perspective. Thessara proceeded with her planned commitment. The Kelvar faction accepted gratefully. The session concluded with all parties apparently satisfied. But after the representatives had departed, Thessara confronted David in the strategy room with controlled fury that her diplomatic training barely contained. "You undermined my authority in front of foreign representatives and my own senior advisors. That was unacceptable. I disagreed with a decision I believed was strategically flawed," David said calmly, meeting her anger with steady composure. That's different from undermining your authority. I stated my perspective clearly and accepted your final decision. That's what advisors do. You are my consort, not merely an advisor. You exist to support my decisions, not question them before witnesses. I'm both your consort and your advisor, and I support you better by telling you when I think you're making a mistake than by staying silent and watching you commit resources to a strategy I believe will fail. Silent agreement when you're heading toward error isn't support. It's cowardice dressed as loyalty. Thessara wanted to be angry, but David's tone wasn't disrespectful or challenging in the way she understood challenge. It was matter of fact, like he was explaining something self-evident to someone who'd momentarily missed an obvious point. In Yveran culture, public disagreement with the sovereign's stated decision is considered disloyal conduct requiring disciplinary response. In human culture, truly loyal advisors are expected to speak difficult truths, especially when it's uncomfortable to do so. Advisors who only tell leaders what they want to hear are called sycophants, and they're considered professionally worthless. He paused. Thessara, I'm not trying to challenge your authority or make your position more difficult. I'm trying to help you make better decisions by providing perspectives you might not have considered. If you want someone who simply agrees with everything you say, I'm fundamentally the wrong person for that role. But I don't believe that's actually what you need. The argument remained unresolved, tension hanging between them in ways that felt unfamiliar and uncomfortable after months of comfortable partnership. 3 weeks later, the intelligence David had questioned proved inaccurate. The Kelvar faction Thessara had supported collapsed internally, and the military resources she'd committed were effectively wasted. The Yveran Empire wasn't seriously damaged. Thessara's caution had limited the commitment enough to make the failure expensive rather than catastrophic, but it was an embarrassing miscalculation. David didn't say, "I told you so." He didn't reference their earlier disagreement or claim vindication. He simply worked alongside Thessara to minimize political fallout, extract their forces safely, and salvage what diplomatic advantage could be recovered from the situation. After the immediate crisis was managed, Thessara found him in the gardens, their unplanned meeting place that had somehow become their default location for conversations that mattered. "You were correct about the Kelvar situation," she said without preamble, sitting beside him on the stone bench. "I should have given greater weight to your concerns about intelligence reliability. You made a decision with the information you believed was accurate. Sometimes that produces good outcomes, sometimes it doesn't. That's leadership. You can't know everything, so you make the best choice available and adapt when circumstances change. You're not going to claim superiority for having been proven correct. Why would I? Being right occasionally doesn't make me superior. It means I happen to notice something you missed in this specific instance. Next week, you'll probably see something I miss. That's how effective partnerships function, complementary perspectives that cover each other's blind spots. Thessara processed this response, which was so fundamentally different from how Yveran political culture operated. In my culture, being proven correct in a disagreement with the sovereign is a dominance display. You establish superior judgment and gain political leverage. I lose face, you gain position. Or, David suggested, we could operate outside that competitive framework entirely. I challenged your decision because I genuinely believed you were making a mistake, and I care about you making effective decisions. You listened to my objection, evaluated it, and made your own choice. I accepted your authority to make that final decision. Later, events suggested my concerns were valid, but you're not diminished by that because adapting to new information demonstrates strength, not weakness. And I don't need recognition for being right because I wasn't competing against you. I was trying to help you. That is a profoundly human interpretation of loyalty and partnership. Probably, but I think it's a healthier model. than one where honest disagreement gets coded as betrayal or dominance challenge. Thessara was quiet for a moment, watching the gardens darken as evening approached. Then she asked the question that had been bothering her since David's public disagreement. Why do you stay? The political marriage accomplished its primary objectives. The alliance is stable, technology transfers are proceeding, diplomatic foundations are solid. You could request reassignment, return to coalition space, and you would have fulfilled your contractual obligations. Why remain in a position where you're constrained by my authority and Yveran customs that don't align with your values? David considered the question seriously before answering. Because somewhere during these past 8 months, this assignment stopped being an obligation and became a choice. I stay because I value working with you, because I genuinely enjoy our conversations, because I've come to care about your well-being beyond its political implications. He turned to face her directly. I stay because you've become my friend, Thessara, and I don't abandon friends just because it would be more convenient or professionally advantageous to do so. Friend, again that human word, borrowed into Yveran because their language lacked equivalent concepts. Yveran culture doesn't structure relationships around friendship as humans understand it, Thessara said slowly. We have political alliances, family obligations, hierarchical bonds. But the concept of choosing to remain in someone's life purely because you value their company rather than what they provide, that's genuinely foreign to our social frameworks. I know, but that doesn't mean you can't experience it, even if you don't have native cultural vocabulary for it. David's expression was patient. Thessara, these past months, when we've sat here talking, or worked late solving policy problems, or had those long conversations about cultural differences that served no diplomatic purpose, did you continue those interactions only because they were strategically useful? Thessara wanted to claim yes, because that would fit the framework she understood, but honesty demanded a different answer. No, they were valuable beyond their utility. Pleasant in ways I couldn't justify through standard cost-benefit analysis. I found myself anticipating them, wanting them to continue, feeling disappointed when circumstances prevented them. She paused, then continued carefully. I found myself valuing your presence for reasons disconnected from what you could accomplish or provide. That's friendship, David said simply, valuing someone beyond their utility, choosing their company because the alternative, their absence, feels like loss. You might not have cultural language for it, but you've been experiencing it. Thessara sat with this realization, trying to integrate it into her understanding of relationships, and finding it didn't quite fit any existing category. I have developed a friendship with you, she said slowly, testing the human word in Yveran context. A relationship type my culture doesn't formally acknowledge. This is unusual. Unusual maybe, but is it unwanted? No, Thessara admitted. It is not unwanted. It is, in fact, one of the most valuable aspects of my current existence. I simply lack proper frameworks for processing it. Then we'll build frameworks together, David said. Friendship doesn't require cultural precedent or official recognition. It just requires two people who choose to value each other. They sat together as darkness settled over the gardens, and Thessara experienced something that would have seemed impossible a year ago. She was sitting with her political husband, who had challenged her publicly and been proven correct, and she felt no resentment or diminished authority. Instead, she felt grateful that someone cared enough to risk disagreeing with her. Grateful that someone stayed not because duty required it but because they chose to. Grateful for friendship, even if her culture gave her no proper vocabulary for acknowledging it. Thank you, she said quietly, for staying, for disagreeing when you believed I was wrong, for valuing me beyond my utility or position. Thank you for letting me, David replied, for being open to a relationship model your culture doesn't recognize, for becoming my friend despite having no cultural framework for what that means. We will determine what it means together, Thessara said. That seems appropriate for a friendship, defining it through mutual experience rather than cultural prescription. Agreed, David said, and they sat together in comfortable silence that required no justification beyond the simple fact that they both chose to be there. A year into their marriage, Thessara could no longer pretend their relationship fit neatly into political alliance categories. David had become her friend, someone she valued beyond utility, whose company she sought for reasons that had nothing to do with strategic advantage. Then the constitutional crisis erupted, and that friendship was tested by forces that threatened to tear apart everything they'd built. A coalition of conservative Yveran nobles, uncomfortable with Thessara's progressive reforms, and particularly opposed to the visible influence of her human consort, launched a legal challenge to her governance authority. They argued that by elevating David beyond ceremonial duties and allowing him meaningful policy input, she'd violated ancient constitutional limits on consort authority. The challenge was technically about legal interpretation, but fundamentally about power. Conservative factions attempting to constrain Thessara's authority and reassert traditional hierarchies, where human influence was minimized and noble prerogatives were protected. The legal proceedings were exhausting and complex, requiring Thessara to defend not just her policy decisions, but her right to seek counsel from whom she chose. Every decision where David had provided input was scrutinized. Every public appearance together was cited as evidence of improper influence. Her own advisors, even those personally loyal to her, suggested the pragmatic solution: David should withdraw from active participation in governance, maintain the marriage formally for its diplomatic benefits, but remove him from any meaningful policy role, reduce him to pure ceremonial function. It was the logical solution that would resolve the crisis with minimal political cost. David agreed immediately when presented with this option. If my active presence is causing you political problems, I'll step back. The marriage can continue in formal terms while I return to purely ceremonial consort duties. Whatever helps you navigate this crisis most effectively. It was the right answer, the politically sensible response, the solution that preserved both the alliance and Thessara's authority. And Thessara found herself feeling something entirely unexpected: loss. Not at losing a useful advisor, she had many competent advisors. Not at losing political advantage, the marriage would still provide diplomatic benefits regardless of David's active role. Loss at the thought of not having David's perspective during strategy sessions, not having his company in the gardens during evening conversations, not having his friendship present in her daily existence. I don't want you to withdraw, she said, surprising herself with the intensity of her own response. I want you here, working alongside me, providing counsel and perspective. Not because it's politically useful, though it is, but because I value your presence beyond its utility. David looked genuinely surprised. Thessara, if you choose that, it will make this crisis significantly harder to resolve. The conservative nobles won't back down if you're openly prioritizing our partnership over their constitutional concerns. Let them challenge me. I've spent 15 years making every decision based purely on political calculation and strategic advantage. Perhaps it's time I made a choice based on what I actually want rather than what's merely optimal. The constitutional crisis played out over 3 months of legal arguments, political maneuvering, and tense negotiations. Thessara defended her right to seek counsel from her consort, arguing that competence and earned trust mattered more than traditional restrictions based on status. David remained actively involved despite knowing it made him a target for conservative nobles who portrayed him as corrupting foreign influence undermining proper Yveran governance. The resolution was a typical political compromise that satisfied no one completely. Thessara retained explicit authority to consult David on policy matters, but with increased transparency requirements about which decisions were influenced by his input. The conservative nobles gained procedural constraints, but failed to remove David from meaningful influence. It was messy, imperfect, and would probably require renegotiation in future political conflicts. But throughout the crisis, Thessara learned something more valuable than any political victory. When everything was at its worst and her authority was being fundamentally questioned, David stayed. Not because duty required it. He could have withdrawn with complete justification. Not because it was advantageous. His involvement was actually the source of the crisis. He stayed because he chose to, because their partnership mattered to him beyond formal structures or political utility. After the crisis resolved and some degree of normal governance resumed, Thessara found David in the gardens at sunset, their established meeting place that had become sacred through repeated choice rather than formal designation. She sat beside him, and they watched the sky change colors in comfortable silence. "I've been thinking extensively about friendship," Thessara said eventually, "about what it means to value someone beyond their utility and strategic advantage. By Yveran cultural standards, it's an inefficient emotional attachment that provides no measurable benefit, creates potential vulnerabilities, and complicates rational decision-making." "True," David agreed, and I've decided that efficiency isn't the supreme value in this particular domain. You've become important to me in ways that transcend political alliance or advisory utility. I value your presence, your perspective, your companionship. I value you as a person beyond what you can provide or accomplish." She paused, then continued carefully. "I believe what I'm experiencing aligns with the human concept of friendship, though my culture provides no adequate frameworks for properly acknowledging it. But regardless of cultural vocabulary, the experience itself has become one of the most significant aspects of my existence." David took her hand in the gesture that had become natural between them. "Then we'll continue experiencing it together. Friendship doesn't require cultural frameworks or official recognition. It just requires two people choosing to value each other." "You've taught me that through your actions," Thessara said quietly. "You stayed when you could have left. You challenged me when agreement would have been easier. You valued me as Thessara rather than only as Queen Thessara. That's friendship, choosing someone's company beyond what they can provide, remaining present not from duty but from genuine care." "Yes," David said simply, "that's exactly what it is." Years later, historians analyzing the Thessara-David partnership focused primarily on diplomatic achievements. The successful alliance, technology integration, regional stability their cooperation helped maintain. But those close to the situation understood the real story was more personal and more profound. A ruler raised to value only utility learned to value companionship, and a diplomat who'd accepted an assignment as duty discovered genuine friendship. Their marriage remained a political alliance. That foundation never disappeared, but layered onto it, growing gradually through proximity and shared work and countless small moments of choosing each other's company, was something Thessara's culture lacked vocabulary for, but which became the relationship's most meaningful component. Friendship, not hierarchy of ruler and subject, not transaction of political alliance, but mutual choice to remain in each other's lives, to value each other beyond usefulness, to be present not because duty demanded it, but because absence felt like loss. 10 years into their marriage, a young Yveran cultural anthropologist interviewed Thessara for a study on human influence on Yveran social structures. "Your Majesty, how would you characterize your relationship with Consort David?" Thessara considered carefully before responding. "Formally, he is my consort and senior advisor. Those relationships are well documented and structurally defined. But personally," she paused, then continued, "personally, he is my friend. We lack precise Yveran terminology for that relationship category, which perhaps explains why it took me significant time to recognize what had developed between us." "And how do you define friendship?" given that Yveran culture doesn't traditionally acknowledge this relationship type. Friendship, Thessara said thoughtfully, is when someone remains present not because obligation requires it, but because they choose to. When they value your company beyond what you provide them. When they challenge you from care rather than ambition. When they stay beside you not as subject or political ally, but as companion who genuinely wishes to be there. She smiled slightly. I learned this from my human husband, who demonstrated that the most profound bonds aren't built on power or utility, but on choice and genuine mutual regard. He became my friend, and that friendship, inefficient and strategically unjustifiable, as it may be by traditional Yveran values, has proven more valuable than any political alliance could be. The interview was published widely and sparked extensive discussions in Yveran cultural spaces about whether efficiency and utility were truly the highest values their society should prioritize. Some resisted, arguing friendship was human cultural imperialism, diluting proper Yveran focus on productive relationships. But others, particularly younger Yverans with more human contact, began exploring what it might mean to build relationships on choice rather than obligation, on companionship rather than utility. David, asked the same question by a human journalist years later, gave a characteristically simpler answer. I married a queen because diplomatic necessity required it. I stayed because I found a friend. That's really the whole story. Everything else is just political detail surrounding the central truth. I value her company, she values mine, and we choose to remain in each other's lives. That choice, renewed daily through small actions and genuine care, matters more than any treaty or formal arrangement ever could. 20 years after their political marriage, Thessara and David sat together in the gardens watching another sunset. Their hair had grayed, their faces showed age, but their companionship had only deepened through decades of choosing each other. Do you ever regret it? Thessara asked, accepting this assignment, being bound to a ruler from a culture that didn't even have vocabulary for friendship. Not for a single moment, David said. I got to spend 20 years with my best friend, helping build something meaningful while learning that the most valuable relationships transcend cultural differences. That's not something to regret. That's something to be grateful for every day. I am grateful, Thessara said quietly, for your friendship, for teaching me that utility isn't the only form of value, for staying not because you had to, but because you chose to. Thank you for letting me, David replied.